So, as we said, this is the meaningful involvement of people of color living with HIV, part of the Building Leaders of Color program. Next slide. Some logistics. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on the HIV Caucus's website, www.hivcaucus.org. All of you will be in attendee mode, which means that your phone will be muted. You can ask questions in the chat box. And we're gonna have time for Q&A at the end, hopefully. So with that being said, let's move on. So we wanna really talk to you about meaningful involvement of people of color living with HIV. We recognize that the meaningful involvement of people living with HIV, or as we call it, MIPA, we're gonna say MIPA a lot. MIPA, we talk about it a lot, but as we've seen in the HIV epidemic in the US get browner and blacker, we've also seen a lack of resources towards MIPA. And so we feel like there are particular conversations that have to happen around meaningfully involving people of color living with HIV. So that's what we're here. We're gonna talk a little bit about the history, some challenges with MIPA, and then some strategies. And then we're gonna open it up to you all. Next slide. I will introduce my amazing co-presenters. Well, they'll introduce themselves. So I'm Andy Spieldenner. I'm the Vice Chair of the U.S. People Living with HIV Caucus, and I'm a professor at Cal State San Marcos. Vanita Ray, over to you.
Hi, folks. My name is Vanita Ray, and I am the Deputy Director with the Positive Women's Network. I'm happy to be here.
Barb?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Barb Cardell. I'm from Boulder, Colorado. My pronouns are they and them, and I am the Training Director with the U.S. Positive Women's Network.
Great. And finally, Teresia.
My name is Teresia Otieno from the Center for Multicultural Health, Seattle, and I am also a member of the U.S. PLHIV Caucus as a steering committee member.
And Tiami Luckett has been working extensively with Block for the last couple of years. She couldn't make it today. She's out of the office sick. So we wish her the best. And we are going to do this. We're going to move forward. Benita?
So yeah, we're going to send Tiami healing vibes. But the Positive Women's Network is a national membership body of women living with HIV and our allies, and we exist to strengthen the strategic power of women living with HIV in the United States. For those of you who may not know, we've been around since 2008, started by a 28-member group of all women living with HIV, and we still maintain a 100% board of women living with HIV who are committed to racial and gender justice and grounded in social justice and human rights. So this is our work.
Cool. And the caucus, the U.S. People Living with HIV Caucus, came about in 2010 after the dissolution of the National Association of People with AIDS, NAPWA. A bunch of PLHIV advocates realized that we needed a national voice for people living with HIV. And so the caucus was constructed as a membership organization. It is a network of networks. So we've got membership from all the national networks of people living with HIV, as well as many regional and local networks. And we'll talk at the end about how people can join. But we do a lot of work around AIDS Watch. We're one of the convening partners of AIDS Watch, which is the National HIV Lobbying Day that happens in DC every year. Next. The Building Leaders of Color, or BLOC program, has been a 3-year partnership between NMAC and people of color living with HIV organizations, which have included Positively Trans, the U.S. People Living with HIV Caucus, Thrive SS, and Positive Women's Network USA. BLOC has conducted trainings all over the country that are meant to increase leadership of people of color living with HIV, with a particular focus of trans women of color living with HIV. Many of the BLOC participants were encouraged and connected to their local planning bodies, whether that was a planning council or prevention planning group. Oh, someone's from Indianapolis. Hey. And so Block has been a 3-year partnership, which will transition to another program after this fiscal year. Next slide.
Is this me? Oh, so we asked the question, why involve people of color living with HIV? Next slide. So, as we'll talk more about in this presentation about the involvement of people of color in the HIV movement, we were there, but it was not always as visible or documented, or you don't see us, you know, front and center in a lot of how the HIV movement has evolved. And for me, after being diagnosed with HIV, advocacy became my way of dealing with my diagnosis, and I began to peek into the HIV arena, and I didn't see people who looked like me, and these folks were controlling buckets of money and making decisions. And so I began to get involved as a way of healing myself, but also as a way of bringing a representation of me to the table. And I heard folks talking about nothing about us without us, but it didn't appear to apply across the board. And as I began to learn more about the epidemic, clearly who it impacts the most, people of color needed to be at that table, expressing the power of our collective voice in the decision-making, in the program structure, in all phases of the movement and healthcare work. We bring a unique perspective grounded in the communities and the cultures that we come from that wasn't being reflected in the work. Programs just being designed by people who didn't live or walk the experience and shoes of where we came from. And so it began to be a way to uplift and show value in that unique perspective, as well as really reflecting what the epidemic looked like. You know, MIPA involvement is not race and gender neutral. Just having someone that living with HIV at the table did not reflect the folks who were really being disproportionately impacted. So it's just not having a body, it's who the body is. And it became a way, it matters because it became a way of really switching from just the individual voice and representation in these, because it's just, as long as we have a body versus to the constituent-based voice. And even though one of us can't speak for the whole community, it still became a way for us to begin to bring others to the table and reflect a common voice and perspective. And it also, people of color, one of the things we've had to be challenged is because sometimes coming to tables, the involvement hasn't always been meaningful, and we've had to really fight and ensure that what we are saying is really impacting what we do. And so I have something called the sandbox I talk a lot about, that we are involved, and the involvement is really a check the box involvement. But when we can really demand and push for real involvement, we can make things happen and change. So people of color, people living with HIV of color, involvement really mattered to bring that perspective to the table. Next slide. So the benefits for those of us being involved at all these levels of decision making, one of the things I love the most, I do a lot of work of, I can do leadership development of people living with HIV, and I love to watch the confidence and the leadership level rise as people begin to recognize that their voice matters and they're engaged. So the benefits we get and others get is that what is being designed has a real connection and value to the community. You know, the input can be derived from folks who are on the ground, who are accessing the services, or who are seeing the real deal of what's going on. You know, another aspect of benefit for myself, and I've seen, is as I began to see numbers of us and began to be more involved, the level of stigma and discrimination, began to shift and change, or that we were experiencing because we were being more present and challenging more of the norms of what folks were saying and doing, because sometimes language matters, and the way that folks are included reflects these kind of systems of stigma and discrimination that are really at the heart of the HIV epidemic. We also know that our involvement increases the efficacy of whatever is being developed, the policy, the programs. The shared involvement in that always makes it better. And bringing those unique perspectives I was talking about, and those perspectives from on the ground and in the community really help make policy programs better. So, we all benefit by those of us who are involved. And again, I think I talked about this initially, that sense of self-empowerment, improvement in the lives of people living with HIV has just been astounding. As I know for me, I came from a dark place, and my involvement in ordered me to stand up and see the light and reflect the talents that I already had. I didn't get because I was living with HIV. I was already empowered with that stuff, but I let the shame of stigma and discrimination I internalized it. And so I've just seen benefits on so many levels, from the program development into the bottom line, community and individual. Next slide. So one of the other things that I've had an opportunity to participate in, part of a people of color leaders of the HIV movement, we about, I guess, a little over 3 years ago, a group of us kind of convened to kind of build on what the shoulders of what some of our civil rights leaders and other leaders have been talking about for a while, but really try to lift it up, this idea of that racial injustice is really a driver of the epidemic, and to begin to talk about that real shift and change in the epidemic really requires using a racial justice lens to look at the epidemic and to develop solutions and response. And we formed a group called HIV Racial Justice Now, and we developed something we called a Declaration of Liberation, which began to name and claim our collective vision for resistance practice in the HIV US movement, grounded in these racial justice principles that are in this document. And so the link of that document is in here. And it is our belief that any response to the impact of HIV needs to be rooted in this racial justice framework, and not only talked about in the data that we need to understand, but to really through a lens of the racial injustice that drives the epidemic. So I invite you all to take a look at that Declaration of Liberation. It's like a labor of love for us. Next slide.
So we talked about racial justice, and so let's connect it to MIPA, but we're gonna do that by talking a little about the history of MIPA, as well as where people of color have come into the HIV epidemic in the US. So at first, let's just talk a little about MIPA. What is MIPA? So at its base, MIPA does two things. It recognizes the importance of the contribution that we make as people living with HIV, and it also creates the space within society for our involvement and active participation. So there's two elements there: is realizing how important it is to center our voices, as well as to create the space so that we can influence the things that affect us. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Barb to talk a little bit more about the Denver Principles.
Yeah, hi everybody. So we're going to just touch a little bit on the history of MIPA, the Meaningful Involvement of People Living with HIV, which takes us back to 1983 and the Denver Principles when they were announced. Before we do that, though, I want to say that MIPA and this concept that we have around the Denver Principles around self-empowerment and self-awareness advocacy did not emerge from just this moment. It had a lot of history from the civil rights movement, from the farm and worker rights movements, from the feminist movement. So this did not spring just from the minds and the hearts of HIV advocates. It had a long history about coming together with a collective voice, about collective bargaining and a sense of empowerment and centering those most impacted. However, this was the first time that these principles were applied to a an illness to a healthcare challenge. And so in some ways, it was it built upon a lot of organizing in history, but also pretty revolutionary in its own right. Before we shift, I want to say that this is the original group that came up with the Denver Principles, and as I look at this, I always find this indicative around meaningful involvement, especially meaningful involvement of people with color, meaningful involvement of women, of many of the groups that currently we are elevating the voice of. This is a very white presenting group of men. And so I always look at this and I think that the history of our meaningful involvement also has a lot of problematic white overrepresentation, and that is something that we are really seeking to talk about and to address on this webinar, or at least to introduce as a concept that we want to pay more attention to. So the Denver Principles were released in 1983. They first talked about self-empowerment around this movement. And we always like to start off by reading the statement that they read from the stage. They took over the stage and they read it. And they say, "We condemn attempts to label us as victims. It's a term which implies defeat, and we are only occasionally patients, a term which implies passivity, helplessness, and dependence upon the care of others. We are people with AIDS." And I think about so many of the people that I know in the movement, especially people of color who are living with HIV, women, people of trans experience, so many of the groups that were not on that stage. And we are certainly not passive, helpless, or dependent, and we are only occasionally patients. And so this centers that importance of having our voices elevated when we are talking about HIV advocacy. This conference was really interesting. The Denver conference was meeting about gay and lesbian health challenges, health issues. HIV was not actually even part of the agenda. And so two groups from San Francisco and New York came together and had wanted to launch this self-empowerment movement, this manifesto at this conference, so that it was not tied to either coast, to either group, but instead became something that empowered the HIV movement as a general concept instead. And I think it's important to realize that this is the very beginning of our people first language. So when we demand to say that we are people living with HIV, that we are not HIVers or AIDS cases or any of those other things that we're still fighting now, 35 years later, to remove from really medicalized conversations, that this is a long history. It's a 35-year history of us demanding to be identified and addressed in ways that have impact and meaning to us. Finally, I like to talk about the MIPA pyramid. I just want to give a little bit of an overview. As we're talking further on in the webinar about what meaningful involvement of people of color looks like, I think it's important to hold this pyramid in our minds. And we call it the MIPA pyramid, but I actually am renaming it as the MIPA pyramid of demands. Because as we look at how people living with HIV have been involved, both organizationally as well as in our federal policy, we start at the bottom, and oftentimes this is where it's most comfortable for organizations to keep us as people living with HIV, as people of color living with HIV, as impacted communities living with HIV. It is easy for us to be target audiences, which means that we are the ones who are receiving the services. We are the consumers, which is not a word that I ever use, but I think that that is where it's easiest to keep people of color, people living with HIV, women, youth, I mean, so many of these groups that are not often invited to these conversations at that lower rung of the pyramid, so that we don't actually push back and cause things to slow down or to cause people to be inconvenienced. And I'm using air quotes around inconvenience because I think that that is a way that often voices are marginalized, and that's not very acceptable. Next up, we're contributors, which means that we that they want to know what we're thinking, how we rate their services, but not in any meaningful kind of way. And so this is the survey, or this is the advisory group where you come in and they give you chicken. We can talk a little bit more about eating the chicken dinners at these advisory groups when they really aren't interested in hearing what we have to say. They just want the rubber stamp of like, yes, this works. And oftentimes we look around those tables, and those tables are pretty segmented. They are usually overly white gay men. And so those contributors don't actually even bring the full tapestry of our voices to those tables. We have speakers, which is you stand up and you tell your story about how you acquired HIV. And, it's this sort of story porn where, you talk about how your life was so complex. And Teresia, had an example of this that she shared earlier this morning where, she had been asked to speak, but they didn't want to hear about her thoughts and her policy analysis. They just wanted to hear about what was difficult in her life. And I think many of us have experienced that. And unfortunately, that is often a rung that they like to have people just stuck at. Then we have the implementers, which are the sort of program partners. So those are the program staff. So we know these organizations where upper management is all usually white gay men or people who are not living with HIV. And we've got the implementers, the people who are in the field who are making connections. And those are often people living with HIV, people of color, those impacted groups who are trading on their community connections and their community trust to be able to help programs succeed, but they are not part of the grant writing, they're not part of creating the programs, and they're certainly not a part of evaluating how impactful it was. Then we come to the subject matter experts, and this is the part that, oftentimes is easy as a comfortable place for us to be because we can share our expertise and yet at the same time are not required to change organizational structure. So subject matter experts are when you've been asked to testify, when you've shared your expertise, but when it comes to the true decision making, either you choose not to be or you're not invited to those tables. And then finally, we have the decision makers, and this is organizationally especially. These are those organizations that we talk about, in AIDS Inc. that are led by white gay men, some living with HIV, some not. And they are making decisions that impact people of color's lives, especially people living with HIV, and we want to demand that those decision makers reflect the population that is most impacted that's receiving the services. And so as we start at the bottom and we are moving our way up the ladder, we also, I want to say really clearly, can decide where we want to be, what we're comfortable with. If you just want to share some information and then not be a part of having to make that work, that's fine. As people living with HIV, we get to decide that, but it's when we're shut out of those decision-making processes, certainly that we need to make sure that white gay men and white women are not centralized in that decision-making role who are overarching and making decisions for people of color in particular. So that's the MIPA pyramid of demands that I think certainly can, as we get into doing some of our strategy later on, can think about where we want to be and what we want to do. And with that, I'll turn it over to Andy.
So we've been there since the beginning, but we've seen that as people of color, we don't have the same health outcomes as our white counterparts, and so. We have a higher mortality rate around a broad range of health issues, including HIV, and that this led to death of a lot of the early leaders, as well as burnout. We've seen people having to switch careers, go into disability, and leaving the HIV space completely. There's also been a real attack on MIPA inside AIDS Inc., where and when we say AIDS Inc., we're talking about professionalized AIDS service organizations, health service organizations that are, millions and millions of dollars in budgets that really look at us as consumers and patients, and that's it. And so what we see is that in a lot of these organizations, there's been this real increase in professionalization. And not to say that professionalization is a bad thing. I don't want somebody giving me heart surgery that's not certified as a cardiologist. But I'm not saying that, you need an advanced degree for every job in an organization. And I think that we've seen a real shift between the way organizations used to work in the 90s when people, people were brought in to write grants and manage programs that may have graduated high school, or nobody really asked. They wanted to know about your lived experience. They wanted to know about your experience with community. And now we don't see that. We see people with masters in public health that have never worked in a community, that only did an internship for a semester for a course. And they're the ones that are being hired as program directors. We've also seen that a commitment to HIV leadership has really, really faded alongside the increase of the professionalization and the increase of the clinic model. We've seen a real turn away from the community-based models. Next slide. So we have to understand that HIV is historically located in a specific space. It's always been marginalized since the beginning. There's been, since the beginning, innocent victims, right? Which makes the rest of us guilty. And we really have to be mindful, as Barb was saying, about the language that people use. People of color have always been at the forefront of these efforts. The picture there is from a group of leaders of color meeting with the then Surgeon General of the United States, specifically to talk about the impact of HIV on communities of color. And this was in the it was in 1988, this meeting. And so you see how, like, even at the beginning, we were there. But that's not always the narrative that we have around the history of HIV. Next slide. And so I really want to bring forth some of the people who represent us and who really were there at the beginning. So I bring up, I really want to critique the narrative that a few white gay men were the only ones that were present in the room. There were a lot of people of color, there were a lot of women, there were people of trans experience, and we all came out of different organizing backgrounds too. One of the weird things about the narrative, like we've seen now, like Marsha Johnson's narrative is richer than people thought. They thought that she was somebody who came to power at Stonewall, and she had actually spoken at a Black Panther meeting, the National Black Panther Convention, prior, and so we see that there's a real depth to the ways in which we come to community organizing. So so these are the people that I look to. So ACT UP is something that I look to, and I bring these people forward because I want to enhance kind of the narrative around HIV. So it's not just about Larry Kramer and Peter Staley and Sean Strube. And I like all three of them, but they're all white cisgendered gay men of a certain class background. And I think it's important that we actually look at the other histories, the history of people of color. So ACT UP, we all know ACT UP. What people don't know is there was a steering committee specifically for people of color that wielded a lot of power in ACT UP. And there are still activists from that time that are around, Robert Vasquez Pacheco, Moises Augusto, that can talk about that. We'll talk about where you can see more about that history in a bit. This is the National Task Force on AIDS Prevention. I was lucky enough to work with these people, these good folks in the early 90s. This was a national group dedicated to gay men of color and HIV nationally. And so it was unique in that it brought together across racial groups to advocate on behalf of all of us. And so that was disbanded in the mid-90s due to funding issues. And the bottom one is Katrina Hayslip, who was an amazing leader. Katrina was a Black woman living with HIV. She was formerly incarcerated, and she was an extraordinary power towards pushing women living with HIV forward and forcing CDC to really change their definitions of HIV so that women could be included. There was an ACT UP slogan that went around for a while that was, women don't get AIDS, they just die from it. And Katrina was instrumental in kind of forcing CDC to change it so that women could be included in the definitions. Next slide. So here we have Craig Harris and Joe Beam. Craig Harris was a leader in the mid-'80s who forced the American Public Health Association to deal with HIV. He went up and actually disrupted their plenary and forced them to create a plenary that was focused on HIV. Craig passed away I think Craig died in 89 or 90. But he really helped galvanize a whole group of Black people to deal with HIV. And Joe Beam was a cultural critic and activist who was a writer who edited the anthology In the Life, which is an anthology of Black gay men's writings. And he started Brother to Brother, which was another anthology of Black gay men's writings, but he died after he started it, and Essex Hempel finished it. And I bring them up because, we were there, but a lot of times our histories aren't recorded for lots of reasons. We don't have access to the same distribution. We don't have the same awards. We're like, to be honest, white people have an easier time forgetting people of color. And also, like, many of the activist groups, like any other group at the time and even today, are racially segregated. And people of color, we would go into an organization and realize they didn't speak to us and go, and at the time we would form our own. And I say at the time because we're seeing a resurgence of that model where people living with HIV, people of color living with HIV, are forming our own networks and saying, you know, this is really about our story and our message and our narrative. And so we need to kind of come together and create our own groups, and we'll deal with you as a group, not individuals, but as a group, we'll deal with you. And there you've got a link to the ACT UP Oral History Project, which is a labor of love, which interviews people that were living at the time of the recording that were active in ACT UP. And you can see a real breadth of the women, the people who use drugs, and the people of color who were involved in ACT UP. It's not just one narrative, it's many. Cool, next slide. Over to you, Teresa.
Yeah, thank you. So for people of color, then we want to think, what does it mean to have MIPA, and what does it look like right now in 2019? It has been a challenge, as we have mentioned. We've come a long way, and a lot of progress has been made because we are having this webinar and we have so many networks and people who are engaged and involved in different ways. But also we still have a long way to go, and we can't say that we are there yet. But despite that, we have to deal with so many things. Racism is one of it. One person said that we don't live a single life. We have single issue life. So we have different issues as people of color living with HIV that we have to contend with, racism being one of them. And I'm thinking, when you get into a space and someone makes a comment that makes you uncomfortable as a person of color, then that disorients you and what you are planning to share or to engage, and at the level of which you're going to participate in such a forum or in such a space. And so the ism, all of them combined, sexism, heterosexism, really define or gives us a challenge up to the level of our participation and how MIPA is defined by so many people. The other thing that can be very intimidating is the formal education for many people, because we see that there is less and less recognition of people who have not gone to school. For example, if you go to a meeting and your name does not end with so many titles, then your input is not accepted, or you don't feel as if there's greater or meaningful involvement in your comments. And I don't know, maybe it is me, I've said something once, and maybe because of the accent that I have, and people didn't get it, but I've had someone, a white guy, repeat the same thing, and everybody claps, you know. And I kept on wondering, what did he say new that I had not said? And so something like that, because he's a doctor, he has a PhD, and so his comment is so smart, well coordinated, and so people feel that he had he said the right thing, but someone else had commented about that. So that privilege also really hinders our involvement as people of color living with HIV. And disclosure of our HIV status, someone mentioned earlier, when you go to spaces and you're expected to disclose your HIV status, to mention how horrible you were before and how God has helped you all this far, and now you are alive, really that also hinders our participation, because it reinforces the trauma that we've already gone through. And then the other thing is issues of immigration. And this is a huge thing. Myself as a person of color, also an immigrant woman who is dealing with other issues, including poverty, including documentation and other things, then you feel limited in the ways that you are engaged, especially if you have to deal with the current administration. And so thinking of some of the things that you really want to engage in, some of the spaces that you really want to input in, but you can't because of certain laws or certain intimidations against certain people who look like me or who speak like me. So those are some of the challenges that, that we've seen. Next slide. And so we are also contending with tokenism when it comes to MIPA, especially for people of color, despite all the other things that we have to contend with. So for example, being able to be in a forum, but you cannot vote for that, for whatever discussion that is being discussed, or you come into a meeting, but you don't even know the agenda, or you are not part of the process of formulating the agenda. And so you have to come and know what is being discussed at that time. That's really very challenging, and it's tokenism. It's ticking the box that certain people of color living with HIV were part of the meeting. We also think that there's really a way of ensuring that people living with HIV, people of color living with HIV, will always volunteer for something, and you're expected to take up opportunities to go for meetings or to present in a community forum, and not being compensated for the work that you're doing. And so we have so many peer educators, we have so many community mobilizers who are people of color, and yet organizations are being funded to implement such projects, but yet do not pay our people, they do not pay us. And so that is kind of tokenism, being called to participate in a program that in the first place you are not part of the formulation, and also you cannot be paid through that. So the other thing is that expectation that people of color will always represent the whole community, and that is gross, because we are not homogeneous, we have different issues. And so when I'm present in a meeting, then it should not be assumed that I'm representing everybody or people of color from all communities. But that being said, there should be an opportunity to have inputs. For example, when I'm representing, because we know some meetings are very small, and maybe there is only one person of color who should be in that meeting, or one person living with HIV, then a process where I can get input from the community or from my members of the community, if it is women living with HIV or people of color from certain regions, then I'm able to participate and get their input and bring them on the table. So then we can say that we are all represented. The other thing is the issues of medicalization of HIV. And so there is less and less focus of meaningful involvement of people living with HIV. And every time keep on saying that, oh, we now have treatment, or now people can live longer, as if all the other issues we talked about here are not important for us as people of color living with HIV. And so there's lack of funding for advocacy issues, for advocacy forums or opportunities, even for networks that like the Positive Caucus, and also shrinking spaces for our movement to be able to participate in that. Next. So, but then there are things that we can do. What can we do to improve that, or how can we use the opportunities that we have at the moment to bring our voices at the table? Next. Yeah, different things, being available and taking up spaces that we already have, like the Planning Council. When I joined the Planning Council here in Seattle, it was so intimidating for me in the first place, because everybody was speaking very fast, and I was just learning how to adjust my language and the language that was being spoken here. The other thing is that the data was so difficult to understand, and that can be intimidating to anyone who comes there for the first time, including those who are like they have formal education. And so taking time to understand the processes, and also being able to see and learn what is going to be discussed tomorrow, if the meeting is tomorrow, and being involved in certain committees, for example, for the Planning Council, and making sure that our voices count. So we just don't go there and tick the box as people of color living with HIV. We want to be meaningfully engaged. We want to make sure that we leave a mark. And I like saying this, sometimes what we say might make other people uncomfortable there, because that is your truth. That is what you stand for. So stick to that. And that's what I do, even though it makes other people uncomfortable, even though they might not even understand what I'm saying in the first place. But sometimes I've written it down so that everyone can read if they don't understand my language or my accent. The other thing is to being involved in lobby days, for example, the AIDS Watch. Can we present ourselves there during AIDS Watch every year, and making sure that we are also in local Department of Health forums or government meetings that are happening. So our community initiatives need to be recognized, but they will not be recognized if we are not on the table. As we have said more and more again, if we are not on the table, we are on the menu, and someone is benefiting from us as people of color living with HIV. And so, I think there's so many other ways that we can think of, or challenges that we face, and we can have time to discuss that. But next slide, please. So there are various ways that we can know that there is MIPA, especially in an organization. We can see the board membership, who is part of the board. How can we ensure that the board also represent the people that we are saying that we serve? Also, staff diversity. Do we have people of color living with HIV who are working in such programs? I don't know how many people who have gone to meetings, and every time someone stands up to speak, they keep on saying, we help them. We have been doing this for them. And I keep wondering, who are them? Where are they? And so that language needs to stop if we are in such organizations, and speak out. I shared earlier an organization I'm working with, the Center for Multicultural Health here in Seattle, that employs people who look like the community that we serve. So if it is immigrant population, for example, I work with immigrant population who speak my language as well, and other people who speak different languages, but they look like me, then people feel comfortable and they are able to share and feel free to come for services. But also, we don't want to have people who work in certain levels only as peer educators, or lower levels of the organizations, who make important decisions in that organizations. So we need to ensure that that is happening, if it is not already happening in our organization. And issues of resources and funding. You know, sometimes it is challenging to see that some of the funded agencies to do certain work is based on how well a proposal is being written, and so not thinking about other challenges that people of color are facing, and the capacity that they may be lacking in doing that. So what, for example, the donor funding community is doing to support people of color to access such resources. Andy.
Thank you, Tricia. I mean, I think you brought up so many good points, and one of the things I really want to highlight and bring forward was the fact that, you know, to really make MIPA happen, to make our participation meaningful, we need to feel safe, we need to be included, it needs to be an inclusive space. And there are lots of ways to do that. And part of the ways that we have to do that is to make sure that we check in with people and see what the cultural practices are, what people's personal experiences are, what people's personal beliefs are, and what would make people feel safe. We can't have MIPA if people don't feel like they can go to the meeting, or they feel like you know, their voice doesn't matter. And so particularly when we think about marginalized groups like trans women of trans experience, people of trans experience, people who have been in prison, people who use drugs, sex workers, these are people that are constantly marginalized in society, people who have been homeless. And to make people feel comfortable enough to participate, we need to think about what the structures are that we are operating in, and how do we make the space safe for people to participate. Acknowledging that for some people to feel safe, others are going to have to be a little uncomfortable. You know, Robert's Rules of Order, for instance, they're a method of controlling a room. This is true, but for some of us, it inflicts harm. because it's a set of rules that not everyone has access to. And so when people say, oh, we're going to use Robert's Rules of Orders because they're universal and everyone feels safe with it, we have to like stick up for people who might not, and acknowledge that not everyone has that set of skills, experiences with that particular mode of running a meeting. So we have to be cautious about that. You know, how do we create spaces where people of trans experience feel safe going? You know, I was at USCA one year. Oops. I was at a conference, I won't say which one, and somebody thought that they were, there was a trans woman who was talking to a hotel staff, and somebody thought they were being cool and went up and said, and totally outed her as trans to the hotel staff, just said, hey girl, you look fabulous, you know, and all this. And it was shocking because it put that woman in complete danger at that moment. And you could tell that this sister, this trans woman, completely like froze up because the person she had been talking to did not realize she was trans. And in that really innocent moment, I saw how different that experience was of being outed at a conference in the hotel just for being trans, and how much danger that put her in. Whether, you know, and we need to think about that. Like, how do we make those spaces safe, including around HIV disclosure? Do people have to disclose all parts of their identity? How do we make space for people who aren't as comfortable being out about their HIV status? Is there a space for that? And these are the things that we have to think about. Next slide, unless anyone wants to add anything. Anyone want to jump in? Okay. Cool. So how do we build MIPA? So we need to hold funders accountable. We need to hold funders accountable to invest in MIPA-driven organizations. Sorry, my phone is going off. And I don't know, I'm so old, I don't know how to disconnect my phone from my computer. So I apologize for that in advance. How do we build MIPA? We need to hold funders accountable. We need to ask them we need to demand and ask that funders invest in networks of people living with HIV and other organizations that are led by people of color living with HIV. This is important, and that funding has to be meaningful also. It has to look at whether organizations are actually MIPA oriented, not if they have a community advisory board, but really how many board members, how many staff people. I remember Barb and I did a visit with an organization that said, well, when we asked them how many staff people are openly living with HIV, they said, we don't know, we don't ask, and nobody talks about it. And we are supporting, we're protecting people. And we were like, actually, that probably means you've got a pretty stigmatizing workplace because, you know, as people living with HIV, we do talk about our health, especially in a healthcare setting. And so the fact that this was a clinic where they were like, oh no, we don't have any, we don't know, we don't ask, that really, we're like, well, you might want to think about the culture of the organization and what do you have up that's kind of preventing people from doing that? Or whether there's even the possibility of having, like, I know one organization had a confidential staff group of people living with HIV where you didn't have to disclose, nobody knew who you were, but there was a staff support group for people living with HIV. So even mechanisms like that, where you're not forcing disclosure, but you're encouraging the support. And do organizations do that? Are organizations centering people of color, people of trans experience, people who use drugs, sex workers, those who've been incarcerated, immigrants, migrants, when they deal with MIPA? Or is it just one particular part of the population of people living with HIV that they are listening to? And I understand that organizations have to change in order to listen better to us, but that is what we are asking them to do. That is what we were telling them is meaningful involvement. Change the way you listen to us, listen. And then change the way that we say makes sense to us. And I think that that's something that we should be more open about. Something that came up earlier in the earlier webinar that we did is the real cost of being meaningfully involved. And if you do call people out, that there's a cost sometimes, and people will shut people down who are doing it. People will ignore them. They won't be invited back to meetings. And one of the solutions to that, one of the strategies, is to build up. So it's like 2-3 of you going into meetings to call people out. It's so easy for organizations and for planning groups and for different organizations to say it's the one person's problem. You're the problem. you're an individual. But when there's 2, 3 people, it's much harder for them to be able to dismiss all of you. And it puts them on blast more. And then you also don't have to be the one yelling. You've got partners that'll do it for you. Next slide.
All right, so as we talk about safe space, I think it's important to say that for white people, it is easy for us to think that we need to worry about having safe space, and that is not what we were talking about. When we talk about white allyship, and especially by people living with HIV, we need to acknowledge the past damage that has been done by having voices of color that have been not held on to as part of the narrative, that are not part of the common photographic history even. And so when we talk about race, it's a difficult conversation, but as white allies, especially in the HIV community, we need to show up and acknowledge where we have privilege, where we need to yield our privilege, where we can hold brave space. So when I talk to a lot of white people living with HIV, I talk about the challenge around us holding brave space so that our communities of color and our siblings in the communities of color can feel safe, that is a challenge for us, that white supremacy needs to be dismantled and addressed, and we need to call it out even within ourselves, within our organizations when it's there. White fragility is not an excuse, and that we need to demand in these organizational structures, when we see that the hierarchy, that the management level is all white gay men or white women, that we need to demand that change. And most importantly, we need to start saying that we're just going to stop, that we're going to just stop perpetuating the damage. A lot of times, as we're puzzling through with a lot of white fragility, it's easy for us to come into spaces that we share with people of color and try and process that. And the reality is we need to stop that. We need to just stop trying to have people of color help us process our feelings. If you do not have a group that talks about dismantling racism or doing anti-racism work for white people, you need to ask to have that form and have it led by someone who is able to do that work so that we can start dismantling our own racism and start supporting people who really, really need us to do that. So just stop doing the damage, just stop with the comments that can be overheard, just stop making spaces unsafe for communities of color, for people living with HIV of color. And if you see someone who's saying something, also say, not here. Not here do we need to process your feelings of fragility. Not here do we need to center white voices. Not here do we need to challenge people of color who are speaking up because they feel excluded. And that to me is what white allyship looks like. And I am going to extend the invitation that if there are white people who want to have this conversation, PWN has a White Women of PWN Dismantling Racism group, and I am happy to talk to any white allies who want to stand and support communities of color. And this is the way that we need to move forward as partners, supporting the meaningful involvement of people of color, is that we need to demand that we do better.
And I want to offer one thing here. And Barb, I really love what you were just saying. And one of the things too, we want, I think, our white allies to recognize too, that sometimes a need, and we have to be careful that we need maybe spaces that are only communities of color or Black folks or Latinx folks. And that is not an affront to people. That is sometimes necessary to have some other safe and courageous spaces too, and to bring back to the larger group. So I want folks to really recognize that sometimes, you know, I don't mind the people of color, but sometimes I need to have a talk with Black folks. Sometimes I need to have a talk with people of color. And then sometimes there's a need for the broader group, but that is entirely necessary sometimes and okay. And I just wanted to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that as we sort of acknowledge thank you, Vanita, for saying that, because I know that, oftentimes people feel excluded when there's healing spaces for Black people living with HIV. And the reality is that that needs to be okay with us, because there has been a lot of violence that has been perpetuated on communities, and healing is so important. And so that is not for us. The healing is for us, but inserting ourselves into situations is not for us.
So one of the things that happens as we gain awareness around MIPA is often we feel disenfranchised. We realize that we haven't really been involved in some of the projects we've been involved in, or that the organizations that we get health services at, or that that have been very instrumental to our positive health outcomes, have actually been tokenizing us, or have been or we're only patients to them. We're only people who take medication. Maybe that should be the new thing, instead of calling ourselves, no, just kidding. We're people who take meds. So I am so tired of, by the way, if I never have to see another treatment adherence presentation again, I will be super happy. Because I'm like, can you ask me about anything else about my life except for the way I take my meds? Anything. And so I think that, but one of the things that happens as we raise awareness is we do feel disenfranchised, and it's okay to walk away from processes that make us feel disenfranchised, from organizations and events that make us feel disenfranchised, and really be able to heal and figure out how we want to be meaningful involved, and what does meaningful involvement mean to each of us, because it's something different for each of us. I don't want to put out every fire. That's not my role. You know, so what is my particular and unique role to what I can bring to my local community? Next slide. So we want to repeat the idea that meaningful involving people of color living with HIV matters. You can see the way that organizations have drifted away from PLHIV leadership. I think we've all seen the corporatization of HIV. We've all seen how large clinics have developed, and some of that is good, right, in some ways, and some of that has meant that our voices are smaller. And by recentering our voices, you know, it's interesting. We walk away from organizations that no longer treat us right, and then we get then those of us who sit in advocacy circles or public health circles hear these stories about, like, oh, we need to increase participation of people of color in this trial, or we need to increase people of color, accessing these healthcare services, but they never ask us what we want. They just keep on going around and around and around, trying to think of ways to involve us. And if they just centered us, it would be so much cheaper, and we'd actually show up. And so I think it's important that we reiterate that it's not just about within our own communities as people of color living with HIV, but within our allies, whether they're white people or HIV negative people, that we think about how we can be meaningful involved in all their stories, and all their actions and all their policies. And again, remember that people of color living with HIV, we are the subject matter experts on our lives. We don't need a p-value to determine whether we feel stigma. And I say that because as a researcher, that's often how data is defined. Is there a p-value to it that indicates causality or correlationality? And so stigma happens, racism happens, sexism happens, homophobia happens, and we are the experts at how that happens because we're the ones that experience it. Because finally, I'd like us to remember that, as the epidemic has gotten blacker and browner, we need to make sure that we center the voices of those of us who are people of color living with HIV. I think the last thing is this. Benita?
So where do we go? So where do we go with all of this information? What is it, Teresa? So have you felt meaningful involved in your health services, workplace health departments? Have you you know, wherever you may, you know, take services or treatment or board of directors, you know, have you felt meaningfully involved in the work that folks are doing that impact your life? How about forums or meetings or where you're invited? Have you felt meaningful, involved, or prepared to be at those tables? So, and then have we thought about, you know, spaces that we can bring others to, or even push back when needed, when we don't see the people we know that are impacted reflected in those forums and meetings? How about spaces where we didn't feel meaningfully involved? And all involvement is not neutral, is not equal. So, you know, I think Teresa, and we've talked a little bit about check the box. I've talked about this sandbox where you know, and one of our longtime HIV leaders has a thing that I say to all my folks: don't eat the chicken, because, you know, you get invited to these meetings and they feel like if they feed you and then they could check the box, ask, you know, give you a presentation that they have done their part. And that is not meaningful involvement. So, you know, where you fed gift card and sent out the door and no follow-up, no contribution to agendas or anything. And what would you do to get more meaningful involved as people of color living with HIV, as Black folks, or to bring someone else to the table? I tell people a lot of times in advocacy, all lanes are equal. There are so many lanes. They're all equal, but, you know, your involvement or your capacity could look different for someone else's. And so I like to do always listening for where people's spark may be around youth. It could be around women with children, or just various things. And so finding kind of the places and spaces where, helping folks find places and spaces where they can contribute and feel you know, really empowered by doing so, or also feel that they have something to contribute there because there's something of interest, and it's not all just the same way for everybody. So the way that we share this information, lately I've been doing some MIPA presentation with people who are living with HIV who did not even know about this, and now they're going out talking about the MIPA everywhere. And so one of the first things I do in Advocacy 101 is for the easiest thing everybody can do is just share information. If you do nothing else, is just share what you learned here today. But that's one of the ways we can do something with the information that we're getting now. So next slide. So we've shared a lot with you all today. We've talked a lot about being involved in health departments, planning spaces, remembering that those AIDS service organizations have board of directors that we can be impacting, that we could be pushing back from tables, that we could be demanding that others be there, that we could be pushing back and standing up and saying, no, we don't want the chicken, that we want more meaningful involvement. I know all of you have your own experiences or questions you may want to bring to the table. And so I invite you all to go to the chat box, raise your hand, or ask questions. We also invite you to join the U.S. People Living with HIV Caucus, and we have the link in this presentation where you can go and get more information, or to join the Positive Women's Network as well. We have Women Living with HIV members, and we also have allies. So there's a place and space for all of us. And I want to highlight what Barb has also offered to do for folks who may need other kinds of support. So this is time for Q&A. What are y'all thoughts about the information?
So I want to thank everybody for spending time with us. I know we're running a little bit over time, and you know, we really appreciate that.
So thank you all for your patience, though, and for supporting us and attending today. And we look forward to being involved with you in the future.
Thank you.
Yeah, someone just said something. These are some great comments y'all are bringing in now. Thank you.
Yeah, we've got comments about being an immigrant and how important it is to center people living, immigrant people living with HIV. As we move forward, I think, you know, we feel very strongly at PWN and the caucus about centering, especially fighting the really vicious rhetoric happening right now around migrants and immigrants. So yes, and thank you all.
Yeah.
You've been amazing.
Thanks.
And thank you, my
Thank you.
wonderful co-presenters.
Thank you, Andy.